Everyone in the small town of Haddonfield had heard the story of Michael Myers. He'd been a 6-year-old boy who had brutally stabbed his sister Judith to death while she had been babysitting him in the family home on Halloween night 1963. He'd committed murder for no apparent reason. He'd been fine one minute, then became a psychopathic mute the next. Little Michael had been placed somewhere where daylight would never see him again. The horrified Myers family had left Haddonfield, leaving their old house as a stark reminder of the horrible tragedy. However, the ghost of the Myers murders still lingered in the minds of Haddonfield's residents. The empty and crumbling Myers house was left to the elements. It was a source of endless nightmares for local children who had been scared to even walk past it, believing it to be haunted. Some had even claimed to have seen Judith Myers still sitting at the window, exactly where she had been murdered on that horrible night in 1963. Tranquility had returned to Haddonfield, with its white picket fences, tidy mowed lawns, and well-to-do neighbourhoods, until one stormy, dreadful night on the 30th of October 1978, almost 15 years to the very day. Michael's doctor, Sam Loomis, was returning to Smith's Grove Sanatorium with his colleague, Marion Chambers. They'd received instruction to finally do what Dr. Loomis had been campaigning for many years, to lock Michael away in a maximum security facility. Loomis had studied Michael over the years and watched him grow from that small 6-year-old to a deeply psychotic man who still hadn't muttered a word since that very day. Sam Loomis knew how dangerous Michael was, and he would never allow him to be free. As the relentless rain pelted down on the car, Loomis and Marion approached the sanatorium and were shocked to see all of the white-gowned residents walking around the facility outside. Somebody had let them out. Dr. Loomis knew something was wrong and ran to speak to an official on the gate control, leaving Marion inside the car alone. Suddenly, the car started rocking and Marion was terrified to find one of the residents had climbed on top of the car and was trying to smash their way in. She leaped from the car in panic as the resident then climbed inside and drove away into the stormy night. Dr. Loomis ran over to tend to Marion, realizing it had been Michael Myers himself who had escaped. Where was he going? A few hours later, it was finally Halloween in Haddonfield, and the morning started just like any other. Crispy brown leaves fell in the quiet streets and blew across freshly cut lawns. A chill had entered the air as the long summer was now over and darker, chillier evenings beckoned. 17-year-old Laurie Strode left her house as usual for school. Her real estate agent dad, Morgan, called after her to remind her to leave the key under the mat of the Myers house. This was due to another out-of-towner showing an interest in buying it, until they saw it, that is, just like all of the others. A boy shouted her name in the street. It was Tommy Doyle, the 9-year-old who she was babysitting that night while his parents went to a Halloween party. Laurie babysat quite often and was trusted by many of the Haddonfield locals for her maturity, reliability, and kind nature. Tommy stood transfixed as Laurie placed the key into the mat at the old Myers house, for he dared not to go anywhere near it. Laurie smiled, enjoying her brief moment of bravado, knowing there was nothing to be scared of, for the house was as empty as she'd always known it. Little did she know she was wrong, and hiding in the darkness inside, Michael Myers had returned home. He watched as Laurie bid goodbye to Tommy, following her as she made her way to class. Back at Smith's Grove Sanatorium, Dr. Sam Loomis was anxious in his belief that Michael was a danger to the public. He argued with his colleague Dr. Wynne that Michael was in fact on his way back to his hometown of Haddonfield. Loomis entered his car and decided to drive there in hopes to locate Michael himself and warn the local authorities. During class that day, Laurie felt a moment's distraction from the dull lesson she was in and glanced outside the classroom window where she saw a strange man wearing a mask standing in the distance, seemingly watching her. He seemed creepy, out of place. Unknown to her, this was the escaped Michael Myers. Her teacher called her to answer a question. Laurie, ever smart, displayed that she was taking notice of her teacher. However, looking back outside, the creepy man was gone. Later that afternoon, the bell rang, signalling the end of another day at Haddonfield Elementary School. Excited children in Halloween fancy dress left in droves, eager to go and trick-or-treat. However, Tommy Doyle, carrying a pumpkin, was being apprehended by a group of mean bullies who were trying to scare him about the existence of the boogeyman. As he tripped and fell to the ground, the bullies dispersed, cackling with laughter. But then one of them ran straight into Michael Myers himself, who was now wearing a mechanic's boiler suit. The terrified boy ran away, leaving Michael to track Tommy. Myers got in his stolen car and followed a forlorn Tommy as he walked home. Michael knew that Tommy had been with Laurie earlier that day. 72 miles away, Dr. Sam Loomis was anxious as he stood at a highway phone booth speaking to Haddonfield's police department. They didn't seem to be listening, which angered him. Nearby, next to a train track, was an abandoned mechanic's vehicle, along with Michael's white gown from the sanatorium. As he stood gazing at the road sign to Haddonfield, Loomis now had a great reason to believe that Michael was indeed on his way back to his hometown. As he returned to his own car with haste, he failed to notice the naked male corpse in the long grass nearby. Laurie had finished her high school class for the day. She was pleased, for it had been a long, tiring day, and she was feeling a little spooked by the creepy man in the mask. She was on her way home along the tree-lined streets, accompanied by her friends Linda, a blonde, lively cheerleader, and Annie, who happened to be Sheriff Lee Brackett's plucky daughter. Both Linda and Annie were very different to Laurie in many ways. They were outgoing, popular, not interested in school, and both had boyfriends, but yet the trio remained close, like sisters. As they walked home that day, they discussed how Annie was babysitting just over the road from Laurie that night. Linda, who was out with her date that night, decided she would pay them a visit later with her boyfriend Bob in tow. They noticed a car pass them, its driver watching them from the darkness inside. Laurie froze as she recognized it immediately as the man in the mask who stood watching her earlier. Annie shouted a remark about the slow, deliberate driving that caused the car to brake harshly. After a few tense moments, the car pulled away and turned a corner. Unknown to any of the girls, this was Michael Myers, who was clearly stalking Laurie. He'd followed her ever since she'd left the key under that doormat of the Myers house that morning. As Linda reached home, leaving Laurie and Annie to continue, it was then when Laurie spotted the man in the mask again. This time he was standing behind a bush directly ahead. Bemused, Annie strolled over to the bush to confront the man, only to find he wasn't there. Now Annie reached home and promised to catch Laurie a little later when they went babysitting together. Upon getting home herself, Laurie went immediately upstairs to her bedroom to change clothes. When she looked out her window, the man was there, watching her again in Mr. Riddle's back garden next door. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, like a ghost. When Laurie answered the telephone to a strange chewing noise, She was convinced it was the creepy man and she was receiving obscene phone calls. But it turned out to be Annie fooling around. Annie offered to pick Laurie up in her dad's car and drive them over to babysit that night. Laurie then ended the call and tried to calm herself down. Surely she was imagining the sight of this strange man. After all, it was Halloween. It was early evening, and as Laurie left the house to babysit, she carried a pumpkin that she planned to carve with Tommy later that night. She sat on the corner of her street, watching the local children starting their evening rounds of trick-or-treat. She smiled, recalling she once did that herself, and not too long ago. She then spotted Annie in her parents' car as she slowed down to pick Laurie up. Once inside, forever the rebel, Annie passed a joint to Laurie to then light up and smoke. After a long journey, Dr. Loomis had finally reached Haddonfield and had immediately come across the graveyard. He stopped his car and got out to ask the graveyard keeper to help him locate Judith Myers' gravestone, for Loomis had the feeling Michael may have visited there. As the men meandered their way toward the plot, they made the startling discovery that Judith's gravestone had been stolen. Not by kids as the graveyard keeper believed, because Loomis knew this was Michael's doing. Nearby in Annie's car, Laurie and Annie discussed Laurie's sightings of the strange masked man while smoking grass. Unknown to them, Michael Myers' car was following them. However, the girls were far too distracted to even notice. Laurie coughed, feeling sick, for she was not used to smoking grass, when Annie suddenly saw her dad, Sheriff Lee Brackett, flagging them down as he stood outside of a hardware store. Myers slowed down and parked nearby as the girls drove toward the store. Annie and Laurie opened the windows to get rid of the joint and its distinctive aroma as they pulled up. During a quick conversation, Sheriff Brackett told the girls that somebody had broken into the store and stolen a Halloween mask and some rope, blaming it on kids, unaware of the smell of marijuana. Just as the girls carried on their way, Dr. Sam Loomis got out of a nearby car and approached Sheriff Brackett. He asked for a few minutes of his time to discuss Michael Myers' arrival in Haddonfield. As Loomis waited for the sheriff to finish off his call out to the hardware store, he didn't notice the stolen car that Myers was driving directly pass him by. And by now, Myers was out of sight and already catching up with Laurie and Annie. As the low autumnal sun set on Haddonfield and the darkness of Halloween night descended, the girls arrived at their babysitting jobs and Michael watched them from a distance. Laurie was babysitting Tommy Doyle, whilst over the road Annie was babysitting little Lindsay Wallace. Nearby, Sheriff Brackett and Dr. Loomis arrived at the old abandoned Myers house. Loomis believed Michael could be hiding out there, so that was the first place they would look. Inside the house, the smell of mould hung in the air as the men discovered the corpse of a dog in one of the rooms. Although Brackett did believe a skunk could have been responsible, Loomis knew it was Michael who had done it, for food. They climbed the creaking stairs to the bedroom where Judith was once murdered. In there, Loomis took the time to recount his experience with Michael Myers as a young, emotionless, psychotic child. He came under his care. Loomis begged the sheriff not to create an open manhunt in a search for Myers. Instead, he would quietly wait at the old house, believing Myers would return there. Reluctantly, Brackett left, telling Loomis he would check back there in an hour. Meanwhile, at the Doyles' residence, Laurie's babysitting gig was going without drama. She sat reading the tale of King Arthur to Tommy, who was growing increasingly bored. He preferred the comic books under the sofa, the ones that his mother didn't like him to read. Tommy was still worried about what the bully said that day and asked Laurie what the boogeyman was. Just then the telephone rang. It was Annie over the road at the Wallace's house. Annie was busy making popcorn and was planning to watch horror movies with little Lindsay. She rang because she had news for Laurie, for she had contacted Ben Tramer, a local who Laurie was in love with, and prompted him to ask Laurie out to the homecoming dance. Laurie was immediately embarrassed about this. Whilst Laurie was cringing on the phone, Tommy glanced outside and saw the silhouette of Myers standing motionless outside the Wallace's house over the road. Terrified, he ran and told Laurie about this and pulled her away from the telephone. Looking out, she saw nobody was there. Laurie told Tommy to go and return to watch television. Over the road, unknown to Annie, Michael Myers was now watching her through the kitchen window as she talked to Laurie. The phone conversation with Laurie concerning Ben Tramer was now growing heated, for Laurie wanted Annie to tell Tramer it was all a joke. Annie, growing annoyed at Laurie's reluctance to date, then spilled butter all over her clothes. Michael continued to watch Annie as she ended the call to strip off her clothes and then put Mr. Wallace's oversized shirt on. In the living room, little Lindsay watched horror movies in silence. Just then, the Wallace's family dog Lester ventured out into the garden and started barking at Myers. Annie heard this, but knowing Lester was a constant barker, she chose to ignore it. Outside, Lester fell limp as Michael broke his neck. Over at the Doyles, things were very quiet. Laurie and Tommy were watching The Thing, an old horror movie. Tommy again asked her what the boogeyman was. Laurie, forever the protector, told Tommy that the boogeyman wasn't real and promised him she would never let any harm come to him. Tommy felt reassured and they decided to go and carve the pumpkin that she'd brought over. Over at the Wallaces, Annie wandered down the dark garden path to the laundry to put her clothes in for a wash. Inside, she found the lights weren't working. As she placed her clothes in the machine, Myers slammed the door shut, locking Annie in, his knife poised. He was ready to kill. Meanwhile, in the living room, little Lindsay Wallace was disturbed from her horror movie TV marathon by the telephone ringing. It was Paul, Annie's boyfriend, who asked where she was. Lindsay ran out to the laundry and unlocked the laundry door, saving Annie from certain death. As Annie got to the phone, Paul asked her to come and pick him up from his house. His parents were gone for the night, as he'd been grounded. Myers watched as Annie and Lindsay walked over the street to the Doyles. Inside, Annie found Laurie carving a pumpkin in the kitchen and made a deal with her. If Laurie watched Lindsay while she picked up Paul, Annie would tell Ben Tramer that the date with Laurie had all been a joke. Alone, Annie walked back over the road to the Wallaces and prepared to leave and get Paul. As she entered her car, she found the windows steamed up from inside. Myers was in the back seat. He grabbed Annie, and after a brief struggle, he slashed Annie's throat with one swipe. Now dead, Annie slumped forward on the car horn. At that precise moment over at the Doyle's house, Tommy and Lindsay sat quietly watching Forbidden Planet on television. Feeling mischievous, Tommy got up from his seat and hid behind the curtain in order to give Lindsay a good scare. He glanced out of the window and froze as he saw a distant silhouette of Myers carrying Annie's limp corpse into the Wallace's house. He screamed, scaring and upsetting Lindsay. Laurie ran from the kitchen to deal with the outburst. Looking outside, there was nothing there to see. Laurie didn't believe that Tommy had saw the boogeyman and threatened to send him to bed. It was all in his imagination, but the boogeyman isn't real. It was getting late. Outside the Myers house, the crickets chirped in the silence as Loomis continued to wait. He'd heard footsteps and saw a group of young kids tiptoeing up to the porch of the Myers house. It was Tommy's school bullies playing dare. As one of them approached the front door, Loomis played a trick by calling out in the darkness. The boys fled terrified. Just as Loomis was admiring his work, he then got the shock of his life when Sheriff Lee Brackett appeared behind him. Brackett reported no incidents taking place. It all seemed to be a standard Halloween night in Haddonfield of trick-or-treating and kids getting high. He was getting tired and suggested calling off the waiting and creeping around. However, Loomis convinced him to stay alert and keep looking for Myers, warning how dangerous he was. Reluctantly, Brackett agreed. Outside the Wallace residence, things were deathly quiet. Annie was dead, and Myers was waiting in the darkness. Outside, a van pulled up. Inside was Linda, fresh from the Halloween dance. With her was Bob, her date. She'd planned with Annie earlier that she would go to the Wallaces with Bob. Heading inside, they found the lights off, the house empty. She rang Laurie. Laurie updated Linda about Annie going off to pick up Paul and leaving Lindsay with her. Linda was excited about having the Wallace's house to herself with Bob, and she wasted no time in getting down to business. What neither Linda or Bob knew was that Myers was silently watching them from the corner of the room. Upstairs in the Wallace's bedroom, Linda and Bob made passionate love. Afterwards, Linda sent Bob downstairs to grab some beers while she waited. In the dark kitchen, Bob heard a strange noise coming from the cupboard. He investigated, thinking Linda or Annie were playing a Halloween trick on him. What he didn't expect was Myers bursting out. He lifted Bob up against the wall by his neck, then pulled out a knife to impale Bob against the wall. Upstairs, Linda giggled to see a figure standing at the open bedroom door. It was draped in a bedsheet and wearing Bob's glasses. She laughed, going along with the joke, but then grew increasingly impatient as the figure didn't answer her. Annoyed, she sprung out of bed to ring Laurie and find out what was happening with Annie. As she turned her back on the figure, it started to approach her and grabbed her just as Laurie answered the phone. On the other end, Laurie heard an eerie choking sound and at first believed it to be Annie, who played a telephone prank earlier that day. The sheet slipped away, revealing Myers wearing a hideous white mask as he choked Linda to death with the telephone wire. Deep down, Laurie knew something was wrong. Call it an instinct. She looked over the road at the Wallace's house. The lights were flicking on and off. Something was indeed wrong. Annie had disappeared without a trace, and now Linda too. Laurie climbed upstairs and looked at Tommy and Lindsay, who were fast asleep in bed, and had to make a decision what to do next. A few blocks away, Loomis still waited at the Myers house when his eyes fell on something that surely had been there all along. How had he missed it? It was the stolen car from the sanatorium. He scanned around the now silent, leafy streets. Where was Brackett? Should he contact him? If only cell phones were invented in 1978. Back at the Doyles, Laurie had made her decision. She was going to lock up and walk over to the Wallace's house over the road to investigate what was going on. The kids were safe in bed, and the streets were now quiet other than the crickets and the odd barking dog. The Wallace house stood silent as Laurie approached it, and the jack-o'-lantern flickered eerily on the porch. She knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. So she decided to go around the back of the house. Where was Annie? Where was Linda? Where was Bob? At the back of the house, Laurie entered the kitchen. The living room was deathly quiet. She tried to switch the lights on, but they weren't working. Was it a power cut? Just then, Laurie heard something upstairs, directly above her. She approached the staircase and started to climb the creaking stairs. She saw an orange glow of light coming from the bedroom. She reached out to the bedroom door handle and pushed it open. Inside, a jack-o'-lantern shone by the bedside, and on the bed was the bloodied corpse of Annie. Her throat slit open. Above her, propped on the headboard, was the stolen gravestone of Judith Myers. Laurie gulped in horror and backed away, only to find the swinging corpse of Bob. Laurie screamed loudly now and fell against the wardrobe, causing its door to swing open, revealing Linda stuffed inside, the telephone wire still wrapped around her neck. Laurie was numb with shock. How could this be real? She tried to compose herself, not knowing that behind her was the hideous white mask, with a kitchen knife poised. Laurie turned just as Myers brought the knife down and narrowly missed her arm. She fell over the banister and crashed to the stairs below. Injured, she looked up to see Myers at the top of the stairs, and he was now running down towards her. Laurie sprung to her feet and ran to the kitchen, locking the door behind her. She ran to the French doors and found them locked. As she struggled, she saw Myers' arm break through and unlock the kitchen door. In terror, Laurie smashed through the glass of the French door and ran outside. Laurie fled out into the street, her screams the only sound. She was hobbling in pain as she approached the next-door neighbour's house, but they ignored her, thinking it was all a Halloween prank. Laurie made her way back to the Doyle house over the road and fished in her pocket for the keys, but they were gone. She must have lost them when she fell down the stairs. As she hammered on the door for Tommy, she glanced behind her. The knife-wielding Myers was now walking over the road toward her. Now frantic, Laurie threw a plant pot up at the window in order to wake Tommy. As Myers got nearer and nearer, she started to fear for her life. Just then, Tommy opened the door. Laurie sprung inside, locking the front door behind her. She ordered Tommy back upstairs with Lindsay and turned out the lights. Then she grabbed the phone to alert the police, but the line was dead. That's when she realized the curtains were blowing in the breeze and heard a heavy breathing in the darkness. The window was open. He must have found the missing keys. Laurie glanced around the room and grabbed one of her knitting needles, ready to defend herself. Myers was behind her and plunged the kitchen knife deep in the sofa, narrowly missing Laurie. She swung her arm, sticking the knitting needle deep in his neck. Myers pulled it out and dropped to the floor. Shaken, Laurie pulled out the knife from the sofa and threw it to the floor. At that moment, Loomis was scanning the street looking for Myers. He knew he was here somewhere, to do a circle of the neighbourhood from the back, whilst he did the front. Meanwhile, Laurie hobbled upstairs to the kids' bedroom and asked them to unlock the door. Inside, a teary Tommy and Lindsay hugged her tightly. Laurie told them not to worry, because she'd killed him. Tommy answered that you can't kill the boogeyman, then screamed at the sight of Myers behind them at the top of the stairs. Laurie ordered the kids to lock the bedroom door, and while she fled into the master bedroom, she hid inside a louver-doored cupboard. Tying the handles together, she cowered as the shadow of Myers passed by. Within a second, the handles were twisting as Myers pulled on them. Laurie tried to suppress her screams as Myers' bald fist shattered through the cupboard. Laurie, gripped in fear, picked up the coat hanger that fell to the floor and twisted it into a point. When Michael reached inside, she poised the hanger and thrust it upwards, poking him directly in the eye. Myers dropped his knife to cup his injured eye, and Laurie wasted no time in grabbing the knife and thrusting it upwards in his chest. Myers slumped to the floor in a heap. Everything fell silent, other than Laurie's gasping breath. She sat up and approached the cupboard door cautiously. He was dead. She was sure of it. She flung his knife away and tapped on the kids' door. Once they appeared, she asked them to go downstairs, run down to the Mackenzies' house, and ask them to call the police. As the kids fled, a heavy silence descended. Outside, Dr. Loomis saw Tommy and Lindsay fleeing the house in terror. He knew immediately that Michael was behind it. Inside, Laurie sat composing herself. She didn't see the shape of Michael Myers sit directly up behind her. As Myers grabbed her from behind, he started choking her. In terror, she clawed the mask from his face just as Dr. Loomis appeared at the top of the stairs. Loomis raised his handgun and shot Myers just as he was pulling the mask back over his face, revealing a young man. Loomis ran to the bedroom, finding Myers still standing. He then opened fire another 5 times. Michael, backing off to the window as each shot entered his body, danced like a puppet, then fell from the window down to the ground outside. Gun now clicking, Loomis looked over to Laurie to check if she was okay, unable to shake off Tommy's words that he'd muttered all night. She asked, "What's the boogeyman?" "As a matter of fact, that was," mumbled Loomis as he walked to the window to look out at Myers' body. To no surprise to Loomis, Myers was gone. He silently scanned the area. It was dark. He could be anywhere. Laurie broke down in tears, remembering what the boogeyman had done to Annie, Linda and Bob. Was the boogeyman in the Doyle house waiting to get Laurie? Was he in the Wallace's house? Was he going back to the Myers house? Or is he on his way to your house?